Hi, welcome to our new lecture together. Hoping you're ready and you completed your previous lectures because actually the last three lectures are very connected and they're talking about a very accumulative topic. So I think you need to be very accurate how you're going to address and complete your courses. I think lecture number 11, 12, and 13 are so connected and relevant to each other. So please, please, please make sure that you are reading and building a coherent track with these three lectures together, because this is the only way to guarantee that you're gonna build a comprehensive idea about the material and how you're gonna answer your final exam actually. These are a track how things are built from the theoretical to the practical. If you still remember, we talked that we're going to move from the theoretical historical level towards the new practical level, and these three lectures are adjoined from theoretical to practical. So I hope you're ready. Please join me and let's go. Uh, if you remember, we started to talk about principles of modern democracy role in the previous lecture. Please make sure that you take notes from each slide because these are very important slides. We talked about transparency, we talked about several roles and features. In this lecture, as we used to do, we're going to complete talking about these features, elaborating more the relation and the build of democracy in the modern century. And please always keep in mind these principles are the only way now you can use to differentiate between patterns of government states and democracies. Going back to the principles of modern democracies, uh, let's go further and talk about um, in addition to the economic freedom, in addition to stop abusing of power, we have again here a new important element which called Bill of Rights. This embodies controls of government powers in a bid to protect the citizens from abuse by heavy-handed leaders. As such, the Bill of Rights seeks to protect the rights and freedoms of the citizens by way of ensuring that this protection is enshrined in the constitution of a given country. So again, it is about transforming all these abstract ideas, notions into tools. And it is not enough to talk about the freedom of the speech, it's about transforming these principles into a law. Another principle would be a culture of accepting the results of elections. It's again, it's not only the political tolerance, we are going in an advanced level when we are talking about the acceptance even of the practical attitudes and practical life. Once free and fair elections are held and the winner clearly emerges, the loser of the election should, without resistance, abdicate office and hand over the instruments of power to the winner. However, it is also important that once voted into power, the leaders should rule for the benefit of all citizens, regardless of the fact that some did not vote for them. Uh, the most interesting thing that is this is happening with the occurrence of the American elections, like and what's going on between Biden and Trump is a nice example. Let's talk here about this example, this particular example, the American election. I want you to search for how this election was implemented, the campaigns, and the previous elections of the American community and state. The nice thing that is this election is one of the unique elections that happened, because with all the debates, with all the struggle that happened, by the end of the day, Trump admitted that he lost the election and he is going to handle the authority in a very smooth way, in contrast with what everyone else thought. The idea of election, again, a democratic election, should exactly do the same. You have the right to fight to the extreme, but once the results are announced, you should accept it and you should handle and surrender the authority in a very peaceful, respectful way. Another principle is the principle of um, human rights. Actually, this is a little bit ambiguous, because some authors and thinkers say that human rights is a separate domain. You cannot include human rights in political science. And others are saying there are two faces for one coin. Others are saying the structure of human rights decide which community is democratic or not, and started from the basic of the political regime. Whether you're following which perspective, we need to agree on one particular thing, is that to observe human rights means that you are capable to measure the track of the community and political system. Why do we use this? Because it is the implementation aspect. It's the implementary technique. Uh, in this section, particularly, we are talking about human rights as a tool to measure the democratic features of a community. Unlike dictatorships, democracies strive to protect the rights and freedoms of their citizens from abuse. These rights include, for example, the right to live, the right to own property, the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech, the freedom to associate, the freedom to assemble, the freedom to follow whatever religion you want. Whatever is the set of rights, human rights, children rights, women rights, it is a straight, straight, very straightforward aspect of democratic community. If there's no human rights, if there's no protection for the human rights, definitely there is no democracy. Another element or another principle here is the multi-party system. A multi-party system is a setup where there are more than two political parties contesting for power. The reasons for having multi-party in a democracy are, for example, number one, to widen the pool for choice of the best candidate for political office, to offer alternative views to the government of the day as a result to existence of an opposition, and to enable the opposition to act as a check on those in political office. One-party system led to a lack of alternatives for the citizens and concentration of powers, and have often led to a dictator regimes. Another principle should be the neutrality of state institutions. State institutions, such as the police and the army and the court, should be neutral and not take side or buy politically partisan. Another principle is the role of the law. This implies that no one is above the law and requires that all citizens observe the law and are held accountable if they break it. The due process of law requires that the law should be equally, fairly, and constantly enforced. The role of law ensures law and order and the protection of citizens as they enjoy fully their rights. So it is not only to put a law, it is also to create a tool to protect and to make sure that you do implement, and executive aspect is protected and implemented in a way. Okay, if we talked previously about the principles, and we said that these principles must be translated and embodied into certain institutions and certain tools. And if we're going to move from the theoretical level to practical level, so definitely we need to understand the hierarchy of building the regime, the hierarchy of building these institutions, and whether the institutions are following certain criteria, or is there a certain norm to establish these institutions upon. Actually, this is also another problematic area in political science, because um, ho whoever will study the political science and talking about the institution will definitely confront the idea that these institutions were a gradual development, which means you cannot say that it started at certain point. It is like a huge track of improvement. But in general, let's talk on deep level for this, um, and then we can decide. Okay, so let's go. Democratic institutions. The success of democracy in a country is dependent on having strong institutions. These institutions include the three arms of government, as we said before, the legislative aspect, assembly, parliament, etc., the executive, and the judiciary. Assemblies are respected because they are composed of lay politicians who represent the people rather than be trained public officials. Assemblies are invested with formal lawmaking power. Thus, the name legislatures. Assemblies provide the link between government and the people, a channel of communication that can both support government and help to uphold the regime and force the government to respond to public demands and anxieties. So it is a way to build a bridge between what people need and what the government should do. The major function of these assemblies actually can be collected in the following. Number one, legislation. Representatives of the people, the legislators, are vested with the power to make laws on behalf of the citizens. This makes the law binding because legislators execute this function on behalf of the people, meaning that the people themselves make their laws. It is in Parliament that discussions and debate of proposed laws take place. Representation. Representation is not above. Assemblies played a representative role, providing a link between government and the people, because we cannot all sit in Parliament. The elected members of Parliament thus serve a delegated function. Uh, Scrutiny and oversight. Greater emphasis has been placed on the ability of assemblies constrain or check government power. This is what makes assemblies structures bodies whose major function is to deliver responsible and accountable government. It's for the same reason that the concept of checks and balances is used when looking at the three arms of government, especially parliament that has to scrutinize and oversee the activities of the executive and the judiciary power. Recruiting and training assemblies often act as the major channels of recruitment, providing a pool of talent from which leading decision-making emerge. Parliament is a training ground because it is where the live representatives of the people acquire or rhetorical skills and learn how to debate and make laws. Functions that build their capacity to fill other political offices. Legitimacy. Assemblies promote these functions by encouraging the public to believe that the system of rule above them is rightful. It is for the same reason that even authoritarian regimes tolerate assemblies. So, uh, even dictator regimes, even totalitarian regimes require to have this part of functions because they see it as a protection um, from taking them away of the role. The executive branch of government is charged with the function of implementing or executing the law. This is the core of government, as noted by Hewitt, because political systems can operate without constitutions, assemblies, judges, and even parties, but they cannot survive without an executive branch to formulate policy and ensure that it is implemented. The executive is the source of political leadership. In the broadest sense, the executive is the branch of government responsible for the implementation of laws and policies made by the legislative authority. The executive branch extends from the head of government to members of the enforcement agencies, such as police and the military, and includes both ministers and civil servants, for example. More commonly, the term is used in a narrow sense to describe the smaller body of decision makers who take overall responsibility for the direction and coordination of government policies. Beside the major function of providing leadership at the highest level of the state, the following are the other functions of the executive authority. Ceremonial duties, head of the state, chief executive, and to a lesser extent, senior ministers or secretaries represent for the state. The role performed by these executive leaders is often formal and centralized, ceremonial, as they may be tasks to present their governments at state occasions, international conferences, and international and local level authorities, and foreign visits, for example, and etc. etc. A second function could be control of policy making. The key function of the political executive, as mentioned above, is to direct and control the policy process and policy implementation. A third function would be popular political leadership. The popularity of the political executive, more than any other part of the political system, is crucial to the character and stability of the regime. The political executive's role is to direct and control the policy process. The political executive is locked to, in particular, to develop coherent economic and social programs that meet the needs of more complex and politically sophisticated societies, and to control the state's various external relationships in any increasingly independent world. At policy level, it is the ability of the executive to mobilize support that ensures the complements and cooperation of the general public. Without support from the public or from other key groups in community, policy implementation becomes difficult or impossible. Bureaucratic management. The task of overseeing the implementation of policy means that the political executive has a major bureaucratic and administrative responsibility. In this sense, the chief executive, ministers, and secretaries make up the top management charged with running the mechanism of government. Another function also is crisis response. The biggest advantage that the political executive has over the other two arms of government is its ability to take swift and decisive action when crises break out in domestic or international politics. It is the political executive part that swings into action by virtue or by actions and attitudes of its hierarchical structure and the scope it provides for personal leadership. It is for this reason that the assemblies allow political executives near declaration powers in times of war and for executives to seize emergency powers when confronting with domestic crises such as, for example, normal disasters, terrorist threats, industrial unrest, civil disorder, etc., etc. Uh, let's talk more here also about the third arm of government, the judiciary aspect or the judiciary authority. Uh, that is empowered to decide legal disputes, to decide the legal track, the legal frame, the legal structure, and the constitution. The central function of judges is to judicate on the meaning of law, in the sense that they interpret or build the law, construct the law. This function arises because the makers of the law, for example, legislators, are very often lay people as concerns matter of law. In countries with written, codified constitutions, the function of judges also involves in the interpretations of the constitution itself, and this allows judges to interpret and disputes between major institutions of government or in disputes between the state and the individual. One of the chief characteristics of the judiciary system and liberal democratic system or community is that judges are strictly independent and non-political actors, and this is a very important point. You need to be very careful when you are addressing this because you need to understand that a very clear, precise criteria to select judges as to be a way of affiliating or loyalty to any political party. Uh, it is in a way acceptable to have a relation between the executive and the parliament system, but definitely it is totally forbidden to have any kind of relation between the judiciary power and the executive power. It would be definitely corruption. This is the highest level of corruption. If you're gonna have a, a judge, for example, who is a member of certain party or who is affiliated to certain party or at least who is sharing certain interests, whether political, cultural, economic, with certain party or certain political leader. So the idea of selecting the judges and to build the this power, the judiciary power, is the most critical part. This, however, remains a very controversial and debatable issue in many countries, where the involvement of judges in matters which are political is concerned. To ensure the impartiality of court ranks judges, whether appointed or elected, must have job security or tenure guaranteed by law so that they can make decisions without concern over pressure or attack or abuse by those who are in authority or from, or at least to protect judges from the executive authority in a way. The other democratic institutions and actors include media, civil society, political parties, etc., etc., will be discussed in a very deep way in lecture 15 and 16. But what I wanted to talk about here is I want you to be very aware how we need to distinguish and separate power. I want you to see that uh, how these powers were created and then separated, which were established before. Do we start to establish the executive or the parliamentary or the court, and the structure and the how this were built is the key to understand the progress of these communities. Okay, it would be also nice to see certain quotes relevant to separation of power and how authors or thinkers see the separation of power. We're gonna mention only two examples, no more, and I'm gonna leave you with a set of questions. For example, our scholar Charles Montesquieu, who is one of the scholars and thinkers we talked a lot in this course, and we mentioned a lot about his contribution, said that when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty because apprehensive way may arise, lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute or, for example, implement them in a tyrannical manner. Again, there is no liberty if the judiciary power be not separated from the legislative and executive. So from here we can see that he was talking that it is very important to separate between powers. Let's talk about another author. Okay, James Madison is also one of the most famous scholars who studied and elaborated his thoughts about political science. He said, an elective despotism was not the government we fought for, but one which should not only be founded on free principles, but in which the powers of government should be so divided and balanced among several bodies of country or community as that no one could transcend their legal limits without being effectually checked and restrained by the other. So he was saying to have a good community, definitely you should separate powers. I'm gonna end with certain questions. I want you to see these questions, think about them, try to answer them. Number one, where does the concept of separation of power come from and how it is defined nowadays? Where are the powers of each branch? Are they divided equally? How does the system of check and balances operate in American government, for example? What historical examples speak for the strength of separation of powers as governing philosophy? What are some of the politician aspects? What are some of the potential problems, for example, in America and separation of power as a result of separation of power? How has separation of power evolved over time? What is the relation between the concept of separation of power and the American federalism? How is federalism different in that sense? Thank you so much for joining me in this. Please take your time to search for answers for the question. Read this very carefully and try to understand how everything is linked for everything, how we can establish a system that protects people and protect the government and protect the community in the same time. Thank you so much. Please be safe and um, uh, try to collect as much as analytical tool, because this is the only way that you can have a real productive life. Thank you so much and be safe. See you soon.